Hello, this is a brief introduction to Hannah Arendt, a major focus of our course together. Covered here are three basic areas. First is why we should care about what she wrote and what she had to say. Second is a look at some of the major milestones in her life that might inform her perspectives. And third, an overview of some of her major ideas. First, we'll hear from one of her former students who provides some perspective about why she's important.
If you had to say in the end or in the beginning, what has Hannah Arendt meant to you, or why she matters, how would you frame it?
Well, I will frame it in the following way. Calvino says that a classical author is someone who never stops saying what it has, or he or she has to say. So if I think of Hannah Arendt as a classic, I know and I'm sure that she never stops saying things that are interesting. And I will take this classical dimension on another perspective, the one offered by Bobbio. Bobbio said that there are three characteristics of classic. A classic is an author that is an important interpreter of his time. I think she's certainly an important interpreter of the 20th century. An author is a classic if there is a continuous reading and rereading of her work, as if several generations tend to look at her work and see if they answer the questions with which they are concerned. I think she's also a classic in this sense.
Yes.
And in the last sense, as Bobby would say, a classic is an author that offers you concepts, ideas, paths, categories that help you deal with the day-to-day reality you are now facing, even if these concepts were conceived previously. So I think what she said and what she has written helps us in this sense. So that's why I think she is a paradigm of a classic writer.
So I very much agree that Hannah Arendt is a kind of newer classic, in that for generations to come, we'll come back to her work and find new meaning and new relevance. But that doesn't answer the question exactly of why her work is relevant for us today in 2020, and I'll offer a few perspectives on that. First, it's really important, especially in an election year, and especially in this election year, that we can talk about ideas, and by this I mean political ideas, without first sorting out our answers based on our identifications, whether that's Democrats or Republicans, conservative, liberals, socialists, libertarians, whatever they may be. It's important that we preserve a space for us to be able to think through issues. Second, it's important that we are self-aware about our identity, respectful of others' identities, but also that we don't necessarily jump to our own corners and cut out the process of thinking through issues. Hannah Arendt took a lot of criticism for her criticisms of Jewish leaders in various writings, particularly Eichmann in Jerusalem. But she herself was a Jewish activist and a scholar of Jewish history, as we will see. Third, it's critical that we see ourselves as informed citizens. These days we think about the purpose of education, the purpose of our lives, in many ways, in terms of what jobs we can get, what kind of social contribution we can offer. But too rarely do we think about the ways in which we can support thoughtful civic discourse. Too rarely do we take politics seriously as a way of transforming society. And this is something that Hannah Arendt took quite seriously. In fact, I think it's central to her work. And finally, this is a simple comment, but again and again in Hannah Arendt's work is the essential point that you can always pause, you can always stop, reflect, and think about what you are doing. So, what are some crucial things we should know about in trying to understand the life and work of Hannah Arendt? Well, here's a few milestones for understanding her experiences. First, in 1906, she was born to a Jewish family in Hanover, Germany. And when she went off to university at the age of 18, she studied under the noted continental philosopher Martin Heidegger. With Heidegger, she engaged in a stormy relationship, a romantic relationship. And this is a particularly difficult episode in her life, in no small part because Heidegger would go on to affiliate himself with the Nazi movement as it rose in prominence in Germany. In part to get away from Heidegger and in part to further her studies, she left Marburg in 1926 for Heidelberg, where she studied under Karl Jaspers, another noted continental philosopher and a person with whom she maintained lifetime contact and respect. At age 23, she completed her dissertation under Jaspers' direction, and the topic was love and St. Augustine, suggesting a very different focus early on from the politically infused research that she would take up later. At age 27, in 1933, she was forced to flee the Nazis who had risen to power in Germany, and she took up residence in Paris, where she became an activist for Jewish refugees. Her relationship with her husband at the time had soured to the point in 1936 that they had separated, and she had taken up residence with Heinrich Blücher. He would become her second husband, and she would remain with him for the rest of her life. At age 34, unfortunately, she was interned at a Jewish internment camp. By this point, France had fallen under German occupation, and while not exactly the kind of death camp that existed in today's Germany and Poland, conditions were difficult there, and she was lucky to escape. She eventually made her way to the United States, and by age 45 in 1951, she had taken up teaching at universities. She never sought permanent status at any of these universities, and so she taught at more than half a dozen schools, the most notable ones being the New School for Social Science Research in Manhattan. She also had extended stays at the University of Chicago and Bard College, which currently has a Bard Center to continue her work. She died relatively suddenly at age 69 in 1975. Finally, I'd like to overview some of Arendt's major contributions, and while I can't name all of the works that she published, I did think it would be helpful to highlight a few of the key ones. We will be taking a close look at The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was published in 3 parts and was collected into a single volume in 1951. And we'll also be taking a closer look at Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was published in 1963. The Human Condition and The Life of the Mind, which was left unfinished at the time of her death, were also important contributions, as were several other works, including Men in Dark Times, Between Past and Future, On Revolution, and a number of other works. So contained in those works are a few crucial ideas. In some ways these are paired up, as are the first two. So the viva activa is this notion that the work that we do at home, the work that we do in our workplaces, is of a fundamentally different kind than the work that we do in the public square or the work that we do when we go to vote. And she's interested in this idea of the independent citizen who is working every day to enact democracy. Under conditions of totalitarianism, of course, the viva activa is not possible to see. And Hannah Arendt is one of the earliest and deepest thinkers on this question of totalitarianism. For her, it is not synonymous with authoritarianism or dictatorship. It is something fundamentally new. It's something that appears in the 20th century in a completely new way. Something that she traces a type of history, that she invents a sort of new type of history to examine. And this is something we'll be looking at very closely. Those who are fleeing conditions of totalitarianism, or even more modest forms of dictatorship, will soon find, and this is a sort of coda to her work, that when they leave one polity and try to move to another, it's not uncommon that they'll find themselves stateless, that they won't have a place that they can call home, a political state which will defend them. And so she is one of the crucial thinkers on statelessness and migration, and this will be something we tackle relatively briefly in this course, but important to know about her. And the last two of these are indeed linked again. She invented this concept of the banality of evil and was harshly criticized, often without understanding on the part of those who were criticizing her. This notion that evil doesn't have to be done by some evil mastermind who has committed themselves to a radical commitment to make the world a worse place, but can be the product simply of not thinking about what one is doing. And so you can see the connection to these terms below, the two in one, the conversation that, in other words, that one has with oneself. That she constantly comes back to this notion that we ought to pause and we ought to reflect and we ought to think carefully about our actions and understand that our actions come with it responsibilities that can be judged by others. And that is in some ways the best antidote to evil. So that's all. I'm looking forward to digging into some of these ideas with you. And I hope that you found some of this helpful.